Welcome. Thankful Thursday, October 30th. I am out in the deer woods. I got to spend the weekend hunting and camping. We're out here on a lease, and it's so amazing. You know, I get to spend time in worship with my Lord every day. But there's something special about being out in His creation. The first night we came up here, we pulled our camper up here, and I just looked up at the stars. And we're out where there's no light, so you can just see everything. And I became overwhelmed with God's creation and His might. My name's Wendy. I'm with Dream Big today. This is my new nugget. So thank you for being with me today. I want to talk about God's goodness, beauty from ashes. You know, as we are reading Lamentations, this year is the first year that I really had this desire to kind of dig into it. And it's the first year I really studied it. And you know, they believe Jeremiah wrote it, and you think about what all that Jeremiah had to endure with those people. I can't even imagine the things that he saw. The destruction and devastation around him, you know. And so we read in Lamentations, there are these poems that he wrote in his anguish. And the cool thing about Lamentations is it's actually written with the Hebrew alphabet. Every verse starts with the letter of the alphabet in the Hebrew. There's 22, and it goes in order. And that repeats. Chapters 1, 2, and I believe 3 goes into like a triple. So it's like 3 of the letter A, basically, and then 3 verses of the letter B. But it's the same pattern. Anyway, it's really cool. But you think about the anguish he must have been feeling when he was writing this, just pouring his heart out in this poetry. And I felt anguish before. There's times that we're doing pretty good in our lives, right? We're doing pretty good. In fact, we could even be flourishing. But that's the thing with God, and we see it in nature, is there always has to be a growth process, and there always has to be this renewing process. And so when you see with Jeremiah, you're like, how could Jeremiah possibly grow through what he went through? And he absolutely did. I mean, I can't even imagine how much his faith was strengthened, had to be strengthened, to go through what he went through. So he's lamenting about these things. And then we see in verse 21, this pivot, this beautiful pivot, because he remembers God. He remembers the goodness of God. He's not just dwelling in his anguish, even though he's surrounded with it. He remembers God. And he says, yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. What a promise that each morning we get to begin new and afresh in God's mercies. Wow. And he always shows up with the things that we need when we need it. And I noticed today in Psalm 102 that it mirrored the pattern that Jeremiah's lamenting. And David does this often. He begins in his psalm with this lament. And you know, it says, don't turn away from me in my time of distress. My heart is sick. My enemies taunt me day after day. But you will arise and have mercy on Jerusalem. And you see that pattern with David in Psalms, that there's always that lamenting at the beginning, but then he remembers and then he praises God. And I think it's this matter of remembering, you know. The lament and hope, they go hand in hand. They aren't opposites. That grief doesn't cancel God's goodness, and crying out to God doesn't mean that you lack faith. In fact, it's the opposite. It shows you still have hope and faith, that you can cry out to God and he will hear you. And I thought about nature and how this pattern, goes through nature. And when there's fire, fire is like this cleansing power in nature. And the natives used to intentionally burn so that, because they knew that through those ashes would bring nourishment to the soil and allow new growth to come in even better. Without it, the soil became depleted. And you think about that in our lives, that if we don't get burned every now and then, if we don't go through the fire and burn out all of the weeds and the chaff, then our soil, we become depleted. And we'll just hang on to everything we have and hope that it'll sustain us, and it won't be enough. But we have to be refined through God, and this continue to allow him to put us through that refinement, to re-nourish our souls so that we don't become depleted. That is the growth process in God. And it made me think about the seasons. When we were at this last retreat, the Lord had put on me about the fall time, about trees. And I thought about the process of trees through the seasons. And in the spring, we're stepping into, I'm just going to liken the trees unto us, okay? In the spring, they're waking up, they're starting to bud, and that's like us, We wake up and we start to bud with Christ, and then in the summer, we really are in full bloom, and we're really just like full power, giving it all that we have in God, and living fully in his Holy Spirit, and living fully in the growth and the giving. And it takes a lot of energy to maintain that. And God understands that. And that's why he gives us a day of rest, is because he understands that we can't stay in the summertime always. That there has to come a point where we have to rest. So he brings us into the fall time. And in that fall is where we get to begin to rest, and we start to shed off all of the unwanted things. And the Lord prunes us and gets us prepared for the winter time. And then we go into this winter time with God, and we get to rest. That is the rest with God. That's what Jeremiah had talked about. He talked about having this peace from God, and I can't find it right off bat, but that God gives us peace and rest in him, and that we get to abide in him. And then after the winter time, he brings us into a new season, new lessons, new gifts, new callings, new whatever it is, and then we go again. And we do that for a season, and then he gives us rest from that, But there always has to have that. There always has to be fall. There always has to be that shedding and the preparation for the next season. And I think about Jeremiah today and all that he went through. And, like Elizabeth said, there's always people that are worse off than us. But when we're in our suffering, it doesn't seem like it. And even when we're in our heights and everything is going good, we're in our summertime, right? We know that this is just a season, that we're going to have to pass through different seasons, and that there's going to be different things that we have to go through in this life. And the great thing is we have God's promise. We have God's promise that he'll be there with us. In fact, it says, the wind blew my pages, but it says, for no one is abandoned by the Lord forever. And with Jesus, now we get to have him with us always. So we're never abandoned. And though he may bring grief in our life, I'm just kind of adding to what it says here in verses 31 through 33. Though he brings grief, he also shows compassion. Grief does come in our life. Sometimes it's by God, sometimes it's by others, but that he always shows compassion because of the greatness of his unfailing love. So what season are you in today? Maybe type in the comments what season you're in today with the Lord. And also, let's just give him a shout out of praise for his unfailing love and goodness. That there comes beauty from ashes. You know, I look at my life, I used to be ashes. I used to be ashes. And I just pray that he turns me into something beautiful, you know. And that is all of our hope, that he will turn us into something beautiful. What a promise. What a hope. So also, you know, if you wouldn't mind giving me some harvest blessings while we're out here. We're out here for muzzleloader season. I get to be out here in this peaceful setting all weekend with my husband. Just me, him, and the Lord. So, thank you for being with me today. I love you, and I hope that you always have your hope.